And I needed to understand consequences again. I needed to understand them really deeply. I got arrested again. This time we're sending you to the big house, 16 months sentence, but 9 months with time half served. And it turned out the worst thing that can ever happen to you can sometimes be the best thing.
And that's the part of your story that I really found fascinating, because in a sense, incarceration becomes an important turning point for you. This is Global VID, a podcast about the TV and streaming business with host Eric Lapointe. If you enjoy learning with us, subscribe here or on your favorite app. Welcome everybody to the Global VID Podcast. Today I'm joined by Mark Olmsted. He is the owner of a localization company called Nuance Titles, and he also has a story to share with us today about his journey in the television industry, but mainly as a writer and an author, actually. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Hi, Eric. Good. I'm very good. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm happy to have you here with us. And I want to tell our listeners and our viewers that we're going to deviate a little bit from our usual format. And it's something I told myself I would do with season 3 of Global VID, that essentially I wanted to dig deeper, and so that it's not just about the international side of the business, but also about all of our stories and how we are working our way through this industry. This actually was kind of top of mind even in season 1, when I had a really specific niche that I wanted to focus on. But I remember creating a playlist on YouTube called the Journey series. So this one is really perfect. And your journey is a really captivating story, to say the least. It's a story that led eventually to incarceration. It's a story that led to your book, Ink from the Pen, a prison memoir, a GQ article that talked about that book, and ultimately being optioned by Warner Brothers. So before we dig right in, I want to just give you a chance, Mark, to introduce yourself and what you're currently up to.
As you know, Mark Olmsted. My book is called Ink from the Pen, a prison memoir. And I have relaunched it because I created an audiobook from it. And so it gave it kind of a second wind. I'm also concurrently running my small company called Nuance Titles, which does subtitle editing, QC, and some dubbing in the realm of script preparation. It's a little bit tricky to describe, but all the dubbing that you see if you watch dub programs, there was someone who went through the original script, translated it from let's say Japanese, and then I take the English and have to adjust it to make sure that there's a similar amount of syllables. So I'm basically a writer and an editor.
So let's start to talk about your journey and your story. And let's maybe go early on in the early years, where you went to university and with your ambitions of what you wanted to do. Can you please walk us through that a little bit and how your career started?
So I went to NYU Film School, which I transferred to directly after spending a year and a half in France. My mother is French, so I was raised partially speaking, and then I became quite fluent after my year and a half. But in film school, I made a half-an-hour film about coming out, because I had edited a very dramatic coming out to my mother while I was in France. And that had a bunch of success. So I got out of film school and I'm in New York, and I'm writing a new screenplay that I'm writing and rewriting and trying to shop around to my limited connections. And at the same time, I'm working in the French department at NYU and also on Wall Street. So I have these dual tracks going, which is my creative track and then my professional track, which knowing French fluently and also the other languages I studied was very helpful. So that's what my 20s were like.
Mm-hmm.
And then concurrently, the giant wrench got thrown in the work of AIDS. That sort of changed everything because my brother was also gay. I moved out to California to initially work with him because he was a doctor who said he wanted my office skills, but then he got gradually sick, and I took care of him along with my sisters really until he died in 1991. And that's exactly when a very close circle of friends I had in New York started dying once every 3 months. And at the same time, my script finally got into the hands of a director named Christian Blackwood, who was a documentary film director who wanted to do his first feature film project. And Whoopi Goldberg agreed to be in it, and Joan Cusack. And
Wow.
it was very hopeful. So I had these dual things going on. And then, Christian gets lung cancer and within 3 months dies. Like it was that fast. I mean, he was a heavy smoker, European. Christian Blackwood was the name of the director. He did Thelonious Monk, No Chaser, and he had a fabulous long resume. So he died, and I felt, this was 6 months after my brother died, and I felt really completely unmoored. And then through another connection, I got a producer who was the producer of Fish Called Wanda, who wanted to do it. He started shopping it around town. It was very exciting. Option sent to Rome to do rewrites with this new director called Norman Renee, top of the world, even though, my friends were dying. But I had a lot of hope. 6 months after I started working with him, maybe a year, Norman dies. And he had Kaposi sarcoma the whole time, and I didn't know it. I didn't even notice that he was always wearing a long sleeve shirt. He was a very successful director who did Prelude to a Kiss on Broadway and Longtime Companion. So all the loss and the grief and the professional loss, it created a bit of insanity, especially since I had been diagnosed with HIV/AIDS in 1993.
Okay.
And that's where you basically were on the 2-year plan, if you're lucky. So I was proceeding into the late 90s with this conviction that this was my last hurrah. I had to do my bucket list. And I didn't have enough money to do these things.
To do your bucket list.
Yeah. So after my brother died, I was there to take care of all of his affairs. And he had great credit because he'd been a doctor. I didn't tell any of the authorities or the bank that he died because I liked that I kept getting his disability checks.
Okay.
And I would deposit them and nothing would happen. And finally, after 6 months, they said, you have to go to a doctor and show you're disabled. And when I didn't respond, they just cut them off. That was it. But meanwhile, I was using his credit cards to get cash checks that I would pay off my credit cards with.
And I just want to reinforce the context here is, again, as you said, you felt like you were on limited time. I'm thinking that young Mark would have been thinking, might as well live it up in this moment.
Might as well. I felt like I had an obligation to myself to pack in as much life as I could.
Yeah.
And I tried to do it ethically in the sense that I checked all the boxes that said insure the credit card in the event of your death. And then a year after Luke had died, I forged his death certificate to just add a year. So instead of 1991, it was 1992.
Mm.
And on his behalf, as his surviving brother, I sent those in, and boom, they paid off the balance. The insurance paid it off.
Wow.
And so I had found this sort of system. So I didn't want to, I was like, that was wild. I turned it up to $9,000 or something that was just written off.
Yeah.
And I'd gone to London, I'd gone to France, I'd gone to all these circuit parties all over the United States because at the same time, I was evolving as a serious party boy. I was in my 20s, 30s, and there was a lot of us who are HIV positive who are kind of doing this frenetic Montreal, Boston, Chicago, all over the country. We'd go to these giant circuit parties and we would just dance all night and obliterate ourselves on ecstasy and quote, have a good time. And there was a lot of escapism. So this goes through to the late 90s. And what happened soon after Luke died, is I happened to get his license renewal in the mail.
Okay.
And I said, well, it would be nice to have his ID. It would be easier to pull all this stuff off. And so I went down to the DMV and I handed in his old license, and they said, go to the line. And I had a license with my fingerprint, his name, and my picture on it. And I found it very, very convenient and helpful to have these dual IDs all through the 90s. I was able to work as Mark and still get disability checks as Luke, because I went to the doctor as Luke and got back on disability again when I got HIV a second time, a serious pneumonia a second time. Again, I pneumonia twice in a row. My T cells were very low. There was just absolutely no reason to think I was going to be around and to have to deal with any of the consequences. But I lived nicely.
I'm sensing a but here.
I mean, I knew what I was doing was dishonorable, not respecting my brother's memory, illegal. I was doing crystal meth more and more, and I was getting very addicted to getting away with things. So I did the credit card insurance thing a few more times in the late 90s. And then I was kind of running out of money. And at the same time that the doctor, was like, I have some good news and some bad news. And the good news is that the drugs are working. And the bad news is that the drugs are working. Because I was like,
right. That's what you're thinking. Obviously not.
Yeah, it's like consequences. So I was happy, and then my addiction was very entrenched, and I started deal to just a small circle of friends.
Okay.
And I made so much money, and I started to deal more and more. And then within a year of starting it, I was making like 100,000 a year dealing.
So I just want to clarify one thing. So the incarceration that we're about to start talking about had nothing to do with your brother's likeness.
I was never caught.
Wow. Do you sometimes feel afraid of being caught retrospectively with the book out there?
No, but when they did the GQ article, which wasn't until 2018, I had to go and double check with the fact checker, who found out that I was past all the statute of limitations. And from a moral point of view, I give a lot of my income to charitable causes always, because there's a sort of idea that I have to do at least some sort of Robin Hood payback. But still, I'm not making excuses for it. It was illegal, but it happened long ago enough that no, I don't have to worry about any latter day. But I got arrested for the final fraud, which was, I was arrested the first time for drug dealing. I got a slap on the wrists because, as a white guy, first offense. And I used what I said, they didn't let me bring my AIDS drugs to prison. And, it was only 3 days, but the judge was convinced that I would sue them. So that was my opportunity to get sober. And I wasn't ready for it yet. The addiction was too deep in me. And so instead, when I was supposed to go in to court a second time, I forged my own death certificate for Mark and created a fake obituary. And
wow,
it worked until 6 months later. And I always make this joke: if you fake your own death successfully, you have to move. But I had a rent stabilized apartment. I said, forget it. I ain't moving. And, on some level, it's very clear that I needed this suspense that was killing me to end.
Yeah.
Which means I'm going to die, and then I'm not going to die. And I needed to understand consequences again. I needed to understand them really deeply. I got arrested again. This time, we're sending you to the big house. 16 months sentence, but 9 months with time half served. And it turned out the worst thing that can ever happen to you can sometimes be the best thing.
And that's the part of your story that I really found fascinating, because in a sense, incarceration becomes an important turning point for you.
Yeah, it was my route to redemption. First of all, it was poor man's rehab, because even though you can find drugs in prison, if you're willing to squeeze your family and do all these things, I got that I was done with that. So I finally got my head clear again. It takes a while for your brain to return to anything resembling normal. But if you can learn to be present to your experience in prison, then it's very good preparation for everything afterwards, which was relative gravy, you know.
Mhm.
I had been writing all the way through this, but because my attention span got very truncated under crystal, I was writing mostly poetry on crystal meth, which, you know, was not half bad, strangely.
So looking back,
I'm a decent poet. I'm still a good poet. But I started writing letters, mostly and above all to my fabulous sister. Was very forgiving, in a state of shock, as long as I was really clear that it was over. And I just wrote letters of everything that I was going on around me. And she said, these letters are fabulous. I'm going to blog them. And I was like, what's a blog? It was 2004. And she says, you'll see, because she'll send me printouts.
so you're probably posting on something called Blogger. I don't even know if it's still around.
I don't even know which program she used back then. But at the time, you know, everyone and their mother wasn't a blogger yet. And it was still sort of a little fresh, and it didn't take me long to get, you know, a couple hundred readers. A lot of them were my friends who were following me
Sure.
on this.
And supporting you, I imagine, too.
Yeah, I got more mail than anybody at all in the dorms, you know. And there was a lot of an undercurrent of like, dude, do you think if you are such a F up, because if I was that loved, do you think I would be here? And I was very sort of conscious of having frittered away a lot of my privilege. Of course, I couldn't tell them, you know, yeah, but I wouldn't be here if AIDS had never happened. None of this would ever have happened. My brother would still be alive. I never would have thought, you know, I would have continued on my career. I wouldn't have gone on disability. So, and I wouldn't have had the psychology of someone who's about to die. And as soon as I started knowing that these little stories were going to be up on the blog, it was like all the inmates seemed to step up and provide me with a drama a day. And then my sister would send me back copies of the blog, and I would show them to some of the guys, and then they got very excited and everyone wanted to be in the blog. And
so do you think it was beneficial for some of these inmates?
it was beneficial. What it did is that I was very shunned at first as a gay man in prison, and then it gave me a sort of status, especially when they could read a little bit what I'd written about them, which was funny and friendly. But somehow they all wanted, and my sister would send me like a lot of colored pencils and stationery that she picked up, and I would distribute it to everybody. And I had money in my account, so anyone who wanted a shot of coffee, I would give to them. So I, you know, my familial generosity did allow me. Then I became friends with the shot caller, who was head of the Whites, and once I was under his protection, I didn't have to worry about the violence. There were some very tense moments there. So as soon as I got out of prison, I had wanted to just put the blog together and publish it into a book. But it was, you know, freehand. It wasn't edited. You know, I had to do it all in pen. And I couldn't manage to edit well into something really manageable, because I kept thinking, everyone's going to want to know, how did you get to prison? And that story was so big. It had happened over 15 years. And it would never fit into introduction or a forward, and it kept going backwards and backwards. And so I spent years working on this pre-memoir, and then I finally wrote a blog entry that was like how to become a drug dealer in 7.5 steps.
Okay.
Sort of kind of thing. And I sent it to a reporter for GQ, and I said, well, you know, he'd written about solitary confinement, about crime stuff. And I said, why don't you do a story on me? And literally within the same afternoon, he was like, don't go anywhere with this story. like anyone was asking, you know. But that was like, oh, my first big breaks had been with that first screenplay, and then the directors had died on me. And this was definitely another big break. It took him 2 years to get the article up. About half of that had to do with writing it and researching it, and it was exhaustively fact checked, which is I kind of needed. It was such an improbable, weird story that if I had told it myself, I guarantee you people would have been like, This can't be. There's no way you lived as your brother for 10 years and your family didn't know it. It was like a double life. But it was all like fact checked to death. And as soon as it came out on GQ.com, it was the most read story of the year. And immediately the studios came knocking.
So wait, what came first? Just to clarify for me and the listeners, did the book come first or the GQ article?
The book came before the article. What happened is that
Okay.
when my mother died in 2015, I was unblocked, and I realized that all this time I was so preoccupied, I paralyzed by the idea that she was going to read it and relive. And as soon as she died, within 6 months, I formed it into a book called Ink from the Pen. All my friends bought it, and my Facebook friends bought it. But you know, there was just so much. I didn't have a giant advertising budget. I tried to get it published through regular publishers, but you know, agents who I wrote to were just like, "Oh, gay prison memoir is not going to sell." Boom. I don't even know, because they didn't even send me rejection letters. But I finally realized if I didn't self-publish, it probably wasn't going to happen.
Right. So you created your own small press.
Yeah, to make that happen.
Which I really, I think is great. And I think that's part of why I do this podcast. It's like, as people are developing their ideas, figure out a way to get that story out there one way or another.
I've been marketing the hell out of it. And I become, you know, once I found out that TikTok has become the big new power, because there's a few book influencers, you know, that I've been making the best TikTok videos that I possibly can. But because of the article, Warner Brothers was the outfit we chose. Matt Bomer wanted to play me, although they were going to, you know, fictionalize it. That was very flattering, but it gave it a lot of heft. And for 18 months, the project was shopped around. They didn't use me as a writer, which I think was a mistake, because I would have been the best teller of my own story, but they really just bought the story. And they bought the book, but no one read it over there at Warner Brothers. They just needed to buy it and then take me with you. And so writers were attached and detached. It was never clear why they were detached, and they were taking it to this network and that network, but they didn't keep me necessarily informed. But after 18 months, they renewed the option. But they also said, and this is the development hell part of my story, they also said, don't shop the book around to be republished, because as soon as the pilot's on, you'll be spammed with offers, you know, to the point.
Yeah, that makes sense. So essentially you held yourself back from promoting this book.
Yeah. And it's like, I had tons of podcast offers that want to interview me, and I said, I can't. I wasn't allowed to contractually.
Yeah.
So I said, I can't. And then they renewed the option. And then COVID happened. And so many projects just died on the vine and didn't work.
Just before you continue, I do want to stress how much of a success that is, though, nonetheless, to get optioned by Warner Brothers. That in itself, it is a sale. It's getting your project to the next level. So that's a success in of itself.
And I did. And I also made the option money was pretty good for option money. So that helped a lot. I was never really sure why everyone was so high on this project being done, and then why it didn't, you know, they still had to approve greenlight things during COVID. And I think it was because I thought, oh, this is great in a way for the project, because everyone is going to understand sort of what we went through as a small community. Everyone was afraid of dying, afraid of getting sick. And a lot of people were suffering the grief of people they know. And I think the opposite was the case. People wanted escapism. They wanted Marvel. And suddenly the executives were like, no one wants to see anything about AIDS. And they called it a period piece. And that was my last rejection, was like, I'm sorry, you know, Mark, we've chopped it everywhere, but no one wants to do a period piece. Now, this is something that's happening largely in the 90s. And I'm like,
is that really a period piece?
A period piece is like busts and bustiers. And
also, I think I remember you mentioning to me the last time we talked that because they wanted to completely fictionalize this, hypothetically, that almost makes their point irrelevant, because they could have just turned this story and made it into the 2010s or 2020s?
I don't really know whether my fraud would work these days, but I don't think because of the computers
Right.
talking to each other that it would have worked. So I think,
True.
plus the fact that it happened in the age of, as AIDS was descending and it was considered a death sentence, that distorted me. It really had, it really was part of that time period. And literally the day that the option ran out, I got an email from someone who he had read the GQ article years ago, and he was now asking if I would want to be on his podcast. And I said, I love the podcast. It's called Everything is Stories, and it's about people telling their own stories. And I said, your timing is really good. So Monday, I do my 4th interview of 4 for the podcast, and it should be up somewhere in February, March. So I've got my fingers crossed. So my story is constantly one of snatching victory from the jaws of defeat or making lemons from lemonade. Yep. And so all of this time, after I got out of prison, I started freelancing as a subtitle editor, which I fell into because I took a test and they had better French translators, but they didn't have anyone who ever aced the proofreading test perfectly. So I started editing film subtitles, which means I get them in English and I make them perfect and fluid. And I have a great nose for when something's been mistranslated. So even if it's in Russian or Korean in the original, I'm like, no, they didn't mean this word. This was a native Korean translator who's not as strong in English or Russian, which is, unfortunately, that's why you have to have everything QC. And so I slowly was building up this business all these years because I still had to earn, a living. And then I got my master's at Mount St. Mary's, and I concentrated in creative writing, and I wrote another screenplay that I've been shopping around, and I thought with the master's I could teach, but they're willing to expunge everything but drug offenses if you were narcotics.
Yeah, selling. Especially with students. Yeah, that would make sense.
And, it's really ironic and stupid because with my experience in prison, I would have been the ideal teacher for places where no one else wanted to teach and had really difficult kids with difficult childhood who had a dad or even a mom in prison. And I could have spoken to that. So, I wrote a letter about that to the New Yorker and the New York Times, and they got published in the same week. So that was my little claim to fame too, about the irony of that. And, now I'm a little relieved because I think teaching would have burnt me out and I wouldn't have gotten any writing done, because at least subtitling, I can write on the side, and I have several projects going.
Now, I mean, what's also interesting, just like in your early 20s, when you mentioned there were 2 different options of sorts where you worked with 2 different companies. Unfortunately, both of those people passed away, which was unfortunate.
2 different directors. Yeah.
But it's the same thing now. You're getting out there, you're getting on different podcasts, you're getting your story out there again. You could likely get option. Who knows? Maybe Warner Brothers might even come back to you.
Hope springs eternal. I'm a little long in the tooth, but then that becomes its own story, about the overnight success that happens over 40 years. So yeah, I'm fingers crossed, but I proceed with brutal realism, which is, because I've been so disappointed and had my hopes. I mean, I had the contract from MGM there, but they wouldn't sign it. But we had issued it. That was back for the first script, and then Norman died, and we didn't realize that the studio knew that Norman was sick. But they wouldn't insure him, and that's why, because they wouldn't insure him, they wouldn't approve him as director. So this time around, what I've learned is to pursue every opportunity, and to proceed with optimism, but also realism. I mean, the podcast could be heard by the right people. I could be optioned again, but now I get to tell my own story, and it's just the way I want to. And I'm much more likely to take creative control and to make some insistence, like, you want to buy my option my book or my story, then guess what? I get to write the pilot for the first episode, or there's a guarantee that I will write some of the episodes, and you guys are going to read the book this time. You're not just going to buy my story.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's so many great stories in Ink from the Pen that I didn't even have to make up. There are some stories about my childhood also that are in there that are to break up the action, but that would also be great on screen because I had a very funny and original and neat little childhood. And the thing is that between that and the subtitling, I end up spending 8 to 10 hours a day being creative. And for me, that is how I had to redefine success. For me to be lucky enough to make a living doing something like subtitle editing, which has a lot of screenwriting, rewriting, and between the podcast or the book and writing the prequel, which one of the things I'm working on, plus a novel, I consider my life really grand and wonderful and creative. And my suggestion to anybody who is a content creator is the mantra, embrace the process, embrace the process.
Yeah.
If you're always looking around the corner at the result, and I will only retroactively consider myself successful if I get this result, then you're probably never going to be. And I know successful screenwriters with houses on the hill, and they're always measuring themselves against the ones with bigger houses and bigger projects and da-da-da-da. And so it really helps, and it helps to have gone to prison and said, okay, this is how tough my life can be.
Can I share with you something, Mark? And before we conclude, because I think it's so relevant, I totally agree with you because.
Oh my God.
And I'm going to read this for the viewers. I have a little sticky note on my wall that says, enjoy the process. Because at the end of the day, you have to enjoy the work. The work is the journey. The work is not the destination.
The destination.
If you're always thinking like, oh, I haven't achieved this or that yet, and there's always going to be another level.
Yeah, and I've sold 500 copies of the book maybe, and it'll feel much better if I've sold 50,000. But if I have 50 reviews, which I do on Amazon, that are all stellar, then it's like, okay, you can just assume that 50,000 people would feel largely the same.
Right.
And the book is the same. It's the same quality book.
Your story is fascinating. Must have been difficult to live through, but fascinating nonetheless. And just so that we kind of conclude this episode, what's next for Mark?
I keep pushing the book and trying to find more subtitling work. And I'm sort of finishing that podcast, waiting for it to come out, and I'm going to react in real time. The podcast is backed by a film distribution company, so I have high hopes that they'll want to option, because it's the same story that intrigued Warner Brothers. And Greg Berlanti is a huge producer, and because it is a quote period piece, there's not a time. It's not like it's stale because it happened in 2007 or something.
Yeah,
like
but those trends come and go, and like you said, perhaps the escapism we needed or what the studios felt they needed during the pandemic is different than the type of escapism we need now. Mark, I've really appreciated this conversation. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate you being open and vulnerable with me, and with our listeners. And I wish nothing but success for this book property and your future ideas also that might come about from all of this. So thank you very much for being with me today on this podcast.
And by the way, my novel idea is I'm reimagining my life if AIDS had never happened. So it's a fictional autobiography that also contemplates what society might have been different if 300,000 mostly gay men hadn't disappeared. So it's called A World Without. So I have high hopes about that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Eric.
This has been the Global VID Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Mark Olmsted. To buy his book and support our show at the same time, please see the link in the description. Plus props to our editor, Nicole Almeida, and theme song composers, Amber Goodwin and Aaron Ross. Thanks for listening.